With his promotion to Admiral and assumption of duties as the 24th Commandant of the Coast Guard, his area of responsibility became the whole world. Upon retirement, he was appointed by Secretary of State John Kerry to serve as the U.S. Special Representative for the Arctic, indeed the last frontier. Admiral Papp, would you please join me here at the lectern, sir?
The Naval Order of the United States presents its Distinguished Sea Service Award to Admiral Robert Papp, United States Coast Guard retired, in recognition of unsurpassed and dauntless professional leadership and support to the sea services of the United States of America, reflecting singular credit and honor upon himself and his country, and earning the gratitude of his fellow countrymen, he stands primus inter primos.
In addition to this plaque, we also convey upon the recipient a life membership in the Naval Order.
Michelle, thank you very much. It's a great honor, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure for me to be here this evening, and really an honor. I was honored to speak at the 2012 Congress back in Baltimore, as was mentioned earlier. And if that was an honor for me, you can imagine that this is a double honor, and I'm very humbled to accept this award, particularly when I look at past recipients, people like Jim Stavridis and Jim Mattis and others that I've had the privilege of working with over the last couple of years. It's a great honor for me. Jim Stavridis, yes, I think when he has spare time, he writes books. If he's on a flight, he has nothing else to do, he learns a new language. He's a really impressive individual, and to be included in a group like Jim Stavridis is a wonderful honor. I want to thank you as well for an opportunity to wear a uniform. It's been 2.5 years now, and I've missed it. And it's also good to be in front of a group that knows how to pronounce things like commandery, and commander general, and commandant. Over the last couple of years, I've been to a number of foreign countries and other civilian groups, and I can't count the number of times when I've been introduced as the 24th commandment. And actually, over time, I've decided that I like that. Where's the Padre? I know the first 10 commandments. I'm not sure what 11 through 23 is, but I like being the 24th commandment. But what's in a name? As I was researching some of the work that I've been doing for the Arctic, I've had a chance to review some of the Coast Guard's Arctic history. And as many of you know, and I was reminded tonight, there was a gentleman who came up to me and he said, "You've probably never heard the joke before about the Coast Guard having to be 6 feet tall so that you can walk ashore if your ship goes down." I've never heard the term puddle pirates or shallow water sailors. But I ran across a story which is one of our Coast Guard Arctic stories. It's the history of the Northwest Passage in 1957 when we sent the cutters Spar, Storis, and Bramble to make a passage through the Northwest Passage. It was actually during the time of the dew line construction, the distant early warning system during the Cold War. We needed to find out that if the Chukchi Sea froze in from the west while the construction was going on, could all the ships escape into the Atlantic through the Northwest Passage? So we sent these 3 Coast Guard cutters to Seattle. They rendezvoused with the Navy flotilla, and Captain Henry Parsons was the commanding officer of Storis. He went in to meet the Navy Rear Admiral, who was the Commodore for the flotilla that would go up there. And when the Navy Admiral saw the Coast Guard captain walk into the room, he said, "Ah, it's good to finally see the hooligan Navy show up." So Captain Parsons looked the Admiral in the eye. He said, "You know, sir, we really don't mind being called hooligans. It's the Navy part. So here I am now serving, I are a diplomat now, serving at the State Department as the first special representative for the Arctic. I got the call on the night of my retirement from the Coast Guard. I was on my way to a surprise retirement party that my wife was holding for me. And I got a call from the Coast Guard Command Center. They said, we have the Secretary of the State on the line. And I was wondering, oh my goodness, why is he calling me? I thought it was probably because I've known John Kerry for a long time, and he was calling to congratulate me on my retirement, which he did in the introductory remarks. And then he said that I have a job that I'd like you to think about. He said, we are coming up on the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. He said, I know you've been talking a lot about the Arctic during your 4 years as Commandant. Would you like to do something about it? And of course, my father, who was a Marine, had instilled in me that when your country asks you to do something, there's only one answer. And much to my wife's chagrin, I answered rather rapidly, and here I am 2.5 years later, working for the State Department and trying to help to advance our interests in the Arctic, and it's been a very interesting job. But a lot of the people, when they say, how did you become the first special representative for the Arctic? I say, well, I'm the only one, so I guess there's only one way, and it begins with your selection of your first assignment out of the Coast Guard Academy. Now, many of the people here know that back in the days, you used to select your billets when you came up on your first class year, at least at the Coast Guard Academy. I'm not sure about the Naval Academy. But as I went into the room to select my billet on the evening that was designated, I had believed that I was going to end up either in Boston on a large white cutter or New York on a large white cutter. My fiance at the time thought that was great because she lived in the New London area, which is midway between Boston and New York, and it would be wonderful to be close to home. When I walked into the room, one of my classmates was coming out and he said, "Hey, Papp, there's one ship left in Alaska." So I went in there and I started thinking, my goodness, the last frontier, what an adventure, which might be exciting. I walked in and the slot said, Coast Guard Cutter Ironwood, Adak, Alaska. I said, Adak. I'm not exactly sure where that is, but it's Alaska. It has to be exciting. So after selecting that position, I went back to my room and I broke out an atlas. Now, I guarantee you can go to, because I bought an atlas just a couple of months ago, just to confirm this. When you go to Alaska, there's a big page and it covers most of mainland Alaska. And I couldn't find ADAC on it. So I looked in the index, and on the bottom of the page, there's 3 inserts. The first insert covers the Alaska Peninsula and a couple of the Aleutian Islands. The second insert is the middle section of the Aleutian Islands. The third inset is the remainder of the Aleutian Islands. And ADAC is about 1/3 of the way through the third insert. And I looked at that and said, uh-oh. So we were granted liberty that night. I went out to my fiance at the time, house, and she said, so where are we going, Boston or New York? And my early diplomatic skills kicked in, and I said, it's neither. We're going to Alaska. That's not exactly the response I got. And I broke out the atlas, and I was met with stony silence and a very cold shoulder. And I'm very fortunate that she eventually married me, and she went out to ADAC. And over 40 years later, Linda is still with me tonight. We have a little history of going to volcanic islands, having been to ADAC, We just went to Iceland last week for some Arctic business, and here we are on Oahu now. This is a little bit more enjoyable than Iceland was, and a little bit more enjoyable, a lot more enjoyable than ADAC. But it was a good start, and what it did was it taught me, because most of the time, if she had the opportunity tonight to get the microphone, which I'm very fortunate that she will not, she would tell you a lot of stories about ADAC, including the vacuum cleaner I gave her for her first Christmas present. I'm just getting out in front of things here because she would tell that story if she had the opportunity. I'm being honest with you. Hopefully I've made it up to her over the years, but while I was on ADAC, I spent a great deal of time away because that little ship covered the Northern Pacific, the Bering Sea, and the Arctic Ocean. And I got a little bit of a chance to see all of it. And what it also did, besides teaching me the tyranny of time and distance, as we called it, in Alaska, I also got an opportunity to see the ice conditions over 40 years ago. As Commandant, I went back to the same location then, 36 years later, and I got a chance to see the absence of ice conditions. Identical times of the year, about 36 years apart. At the earlier time in 1976, getting stuck in the ice in the Bering Strait, and then 36 years later going back the same time of the year and seeing no ice as far as the eye can see.
Yeah.
Neither was an anomaly. In 1976, it was normal conditions. And what I saw in 2010, going back to my first year as Commandant, is normal conditions. Things have changed. They've changed drastically. They changed radically, and they've changed quickly. And oftentimes I'll get in front of groups, and when I get into Q&A, they'll try to dispute, debate whether there is in fact climate change. Look, I'm not a scientist. I'm a simple sailor, but what I've done is I've observed things over the years, and weather has been very important to me. Climate has been very important to me, and I've had a chance over the last 2.5 years to speak to some of the most influential and far-sighted scientists and ice experts that exist in the world. And I have to tell you that I went from very parochial interests in terms of maritime safety and security in the Arctic to being very passionate about what's happening in the Arctic now. So it's been very, very important that that we have had leadership in the Arctic Council over the last 2 years. The United States has demonstrated its commitment, and of importance to a group like this, which is focused on maritime history and our maritime traditions in this country. We have a brand new ocean that's opening up. China is deeply involved. They've been sending their icebreaker, the Shui Long, up there for about 10 years now. A lot of people thought it was for nefarious reasons, where they were spying on us or something like that. I've come to conclude that what they were doing is their scientists were studying and confirming the effects of climate change, the fact that these new sea routes are opening, and now they have just finished investing in what they call Neo-Panamax ships. Ships that are bigger and able to go through the widened Panama Canal because it's an economic decision for them. They are saving money by being able to go directly to the east coast of the United States and delivering containers rather than going to Long Beach. And now they are investing in ice-strengthened container ships. Maersk Shipping in Denmark has not invested. They're staying with the conventional sea routes because they say the Arctic doesn't offer them the opportunity for just-in-time delivery. What do the Chinese know that the Danish do not know? Well, I think the Chinese don't have to answer to investors on an annual basis. They don't have to look at the balance sheet on an annual basis. So what they're doing is they're convinced that in the next 20, 30, and 40 years, those Arctic sea routes are going to offer them a competitive advantage. Many of you might have seen a story that popped up recently where they talked about building a canal through Malaysia to bypass Singapore. I can tell you that Singapore is up in places like Iceland and Tromsø, Norway, now trying to look for new business because they realize that once the Arctic sea route's opening, they no longer hold a strategic location on the Malacca Straits, which will be a transshipment point for the world, that Iceland or Tromsø, Norway, or some other place will be the strategic location for transshipment. So it's a very exciting time. We've been looking, countries have been looking for the Northwest Passage, for routes across the Arctic for 500 years. And now it's coming true. And it's coming true quickly. But I would say in terms of impact on humanity, for all the wrong reasons. Because when that multi-year ice goes away in the Arctic, that's the air conditioner for our climate. There's a reason why we've been able to live in the middle latitudes, why most of the population is in the middle latitudes of the world. It's because the Antarctic ice cap and the Arctic ice cap have moderated the climate for millions of years. And that's all changing now. In fact, most scientists predict that the multi-year ice in the Arctic will be gone by 2050. By 2050. They're predicting a route, a trans-Arctic route across the North Pole between Asia and Europe within the next half century. So it's exciting times, and I don't know if we can change it, but I'm optimistic. I'm a sailor, I'm optimistic, and I think that we can do something about it, but it's going to take great leadership, and as you might know, we have some leadership churn going on right now, but we'll see how that all works out. So the other thing I want to talk to you about this evening is history. And when I spoke to you in Baltimore back in 2012, I had a speech I was doing at that time which focused on World War II and some unknown heroes of World War II because the World War II monument was being dedicated, and we were talking about the greatest generation. And I'm going to test you by throwing out a name, Edward Heimberger. Does anybody remember that name? Because I talked about him back in Baltimore. It just goes to show how well you listen. Edward Heimberger was a Navy lieutenant during World War II at the Battle of Tarawa. He was on a destroyer, and he organized a bunch of Higgins boats to go into the island to recover. I think it ended up being about 65 Marines who were stranded on the beach. So he organized a little flotilla of Higgins boats, went in, and then for years he attended the reunion of that destroyer. Used to sit in the back of the crowd, but everybody recognized him. In fact, you'd recognize him as well if you saw him standing next to Ava Gabor with a pitchfork and the Green Acres music started playing. Edward Heimberger was Eddie Albert. And he was a World War II hero, received the Bronze Star for his actions on that day. Well, if I give you the name Douglas Munro, of course, all of you recognize that. Our one Coast Guard Medal of Honor recipient, who at the Battle of Guadalcanal helped to rescue 500 Marines, Chesty Puller's Marines, off the beach. And he organized the flotilla of Higgins boats that went in there. He directed his boat off to the side to provide covering fire for the Japanese that were advancing down the beach. And they were able to recover all 500 of those Marines. Douglas Munro, however, was mortally wounded as he positioned his boat between the Japanese fire and the escaped Marines. His last 4 words were, "Did they get off?" Now, the reason we know his last 4 words is because of a name that perhaps that you don't know, and that's Ray Evans. I think most of the Coasties know who Ray Evans is, but most of the rest of you do not. Ray Evans was in the boat that day. He was signalman first class, as was Douglas Munro. Ray Evans and Douglas Munro met on the steps of the recruiting office in Seattle in 1939 and joined the Coast Guard together at the same time. And they were able to transition from assignment to assignment together. They became best friends. And on that day, they both got in the same Higgins boat, went in, and after Douglas Munro was killed, of course, Ray Evans took the boat back to bring his friend back to the beach. But Ray Evans ends up being actually the more interesting of the two, I think. Even though Douglas Munro was awarded the Medal of Honor, Ray Evans, that was not his first time to the beach that day.
Really?
He had actually brought the Marines into the beach earlier that day.
Oh my.
And on that trip, the coxswain in his boat was somebody named Samuel B. Roberts, which all you Navy people will recognize. Samuel B. Roberts was the coxswain of the Higgins boat. He was mortally wounded as they delivered the Marines to the beach. Ray Evans took over as coxswain, drove the boat back, trying to save Samuel B. Roberts. Roberts unfortunately passed away on the transition back to the camp, but was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. So Ray Evans twice that day went to the beach. Both his coxswains were killed. Ray Evans was awarded the Navy Cross as well and was meritoriously promoted to Chief Petty Officer by Bull Halsey after his actions at Guadalcanal. Ray Evans went on to have a long Coast Guard career. He retired in the mid-60s as a commander. And when I was Commandant, I used to call him every year on his birthday to just chat with him for a little bit. He would recount his stories of Douglas Monroe and tell me how he was doing. He passed away in 2013. And so when we dedicated our new Coast Guard headquarters in Anacostia in the District of Columbia, legislation was passed to name the Coast Guard headquarters building the Douglas A. Monroe Coast Guard headquarters building. And we decided that the conference center inside the headquarters would be named the Commander Ray Evans Conference Center to bring together those two best friends who served together at Guadalcanal. What a tremendous story. Yet we, other than me getting before a microphone, we've got no place to tell that story. That's why one of the things I've been doing since I left the Coast Guard is serving on the Board of Trustees for the National Coast Guard Museum. We need a place. The Coast Guard has no museum, no national museum, and we've been working very hard to get that going, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Because that sort of bravery, that sort of character did not stop with Douglas Monroe and Ray Evans. A few years later, 1952, some of you may have seen the movie, The Finest Hours. We had BM-1 Bernie Weber, who took a 36-foot wooden motor surf boat, 36500, with 3 crew members along with him. And they went out in the middle of a February storm off Cape Cod to rescue 32 crew members from the stern section of the SS Pendleton. The SS Pendleton was a T2 tanker that in the midst of the storm had split in half. Now here's a storm that's strong enough to break a tanker in half, and 4 coasties take a wooden motor surf boat out into that storm to rescue these folks. First they had to get across the bar in Chatham Harbor. That was a challenge enough. And then go out and find the stern section and then maneuver alongside to rescue 32 people. And then you had 36 people on a 36-foot wooden boat. This was a boat that was built to recover 10 people at most. And they brought 36 people and got them back safely. We were very grateful to have Disney make the movie last year. It didn't do so well at the box office, but it tells a great story. And if you get the chance, please see it or read the book, The Finest Hours. It's a wonderful story. We've got the opportunity, if we get this museum built, to get the 36500 as an exhibit. It is still in existence. It's maintained by a society up on Cape Cod. It's in beautiful condition, and we'd love to exhibit it in our museum when it gets built. But that sort of courage didn't stop in 1952 either. Doug Moore was, I don't know, there he is. He was reminding me that when I spoke to you in Baltimore that Hurricane Sandy was approaching the coast. And, you know, here's a big hurricane approaching the coast of the United States, and the Commandant of the Coast Guard is sitting having lunch in Baltimore. And he said something about it, and I said, hey, you know, all the ships are going out to sea, and everybody's ready. We'll be ready to respond afterwards. And sure enough, we did. The storm passed through, and unfortunately, the master of the replica ship HMS Bounty decided to set out to sea and try and get around the storm. Off Cape Hatteras, he was not successful. Didn't work. And Bounty foundered and sunk. 16 people were on board. we launched helicopters out of Air Station Elizabeth City to go out there and recover the crew in the middle of a hurricane. I went down the day after the rescue. I spoke to the air crews. Now, most of you know what pilots are like. They're pretty macho people. And I had a C-130 air crew that was providing coverage and communications, orbiting overhead, and they admitted to being airsick. I've never heard a pilot admit to being airsick. But these guys were out there doing that, and they were providing cover for the two H-60 helicopters that flew out there, and not only found the position of the Bounty, but then deployed two rescue swimmers, Randy Haba and Dan Todd, 21 and 20. Deployed out of perfectly good helicopters, went in the water, and recovered 14 people. Dan Todd, a rescue swimmer, he swims up to the first life raft. You know, this is in the middle of a hurricane, everybody's sick and everything else. He opens up the compartment on the life raft, looks in, he says, "Hi, my name's Dan Todd. I understand you need a ride." You know, where do you find courage like that? It's almost unbelievable, yet we see it displayed all the time by our young Coast Guard people who go out there and get the job done. But likewise for our young Marines, likewise for our young Navy people and the Air Force.